stepping into a new family. The morning sun peeked through the curtains of an upscale suburban home, painting soft golden rays on the wedding dress, folded carefully over an antique chair. For Emily Tran, today was not only the day she would become Mrs. Emily Carter, but also the first step into a world utterly different from the one she had always known. Emily was the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants who found their version of the American dream in a tight-knit Asian community in the Bay Area. Her upbringing was a blend of home-cooked pho, Saturday trips to the local temple, and the ever-present hope her parents held that she would thrive like a true American. Growing up, Emily perfected the delicate balance between the expectations of her heritage and the freedoms of the open, Western society around her. Now, standing in the ornate foyer of the Carters' stately residence, Emily felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. Her soon-to-be husband, Michael Carter, was tall, kind, and deeply in love, a source of comfort in the flurry of nerves. Yet she sensed that becoming part of his old-money, all-American family would demand more than love alone. The house bustled with activity. Mrs. Carter, elegant in a tailored dress, orchestrated the wedding preparations with military precision. Her polite smile to Emily masked a cool reserve. Emily detected questions in the older woman's eyes. Could Emily fit into their traditions? Was she too different? The guests arriving were mostly lawyers, doctors, and business owners. Their conversations carried an air of effortless privilege. Emily felt her accent grow sharper under their scrutinizing gazes, each question about her background landing like a tiny needle. During the ceremony, as vows were exchanged beneath an arch of white roses, Emily clung to Michael's hand with gratitude. The promise of partnership softened her worries, if only for a moment. Michael whispered reassurances, but Emily's mind wandered to the future. Would she need to erase parts of herself to truly belong? The first toast at the reception, made by Michael's father, was full of subtle jokes about family traditions and keeping certain things in the family. Laughter sparkled around her, but Emily felt the invisible line drawn between welcome and otherness. As the day gave way to evening, Emily mingled among relatives she barely knew, mastering polite smiles and answering curious questions about her exotic background and her favorite American foods. Each interaction fed her mix of hope and unease. She spotted Michael's younger sister, Hallie, studying her from across the room, and wondered if Hallie's quiet expression was one of curiosity, skepticism, or perhaps potential friendship. Later, alone for a moment on the veranda, Emily let herself breathe in the cool air. With marriage came not just a husband, but a whole new family, a new order of expectations, and a culture whose rules she was still learning. In that quiet interval, she promised herself she would find a way to belong without losing who she was. The world inside the Carter home was dazzling, but also unfamiliar, and the first step through its doors felt both thrilling and daunting. Little did Emily know that these opening moments in her new life would set the stage for challenges and choices that would test the very core of her identity and strength. Unspoken tensions. From the very first days after the wedding, Emily found herself learning the silent choreography of Carter family life. The house, with its gleaming hardwood floors and sun-filled kitchen, ran on an invisible schedule that everyone seemed to know by heart. Everyone except her. Each morning, Mrs. Carter rose early, her heels clicking against the tile as she prepared black coffee and a precisely portioned breakfast. Emily, trying to be helpful, offered her own suggestions. Maybe a splash of condensed milk in the coffee? Or a side of sticky rice she remembered from her childhood meals. But Mrs. Carter only offered a polished smile and gently steered the menu back to grapefruit segments, wheat toast, and poached eggs. Emily noticed, too, that whenever she set the table, forks and knives were subtly moved back to their proper alignment after she left the room. At dinner, the family gathered beneath a sparkling chandelier, their voices weaving together in lively conversation about the stock market, new court cases, weekend golf plans. Michael's older brother, Ethan, dominated the table, often raising his eyebrows at Emily when she hesitated before speaking. "What's your take on the FDA's new regulatory policies, Emily?" he asked once, the question floating over her half-finished plate. Emily, caught between cultures, wondered if she was expected to venture an opinion, or if her silence would be interpreted as ignorance. Subtle differences in daily habits built invisible barriers. Emily rinsed rice 3 times before cooking it in the stainless steel pot, as her mother taught her, prompting Hallie to ask aloud if Emily didn't trust the American rice to be clean. Toothpaste, left in the bathroom, not squeezed from the bottom, drew a sigh from Mrs. Carter. Even the way Emily folded towels, once crisp and square, now slightly rounded from her unfamiliar hands, became a quiet symbol of how she was always, just slightly, out of sync. These frictions rarely erupted into outright arguments, but rather showed themselves in gentle corrections, glances exchanged between family members, or a lingering silence after Emily's attempts to join in the banter. On TV nights, when everyone gathered to watch the latest legal drama, Emily offered to bring out snacks she'd made from a Vietnamese recipe blog. The response was polite, yet unmistakably cool. Her spring rolls remained nearly untouched, sitting awkwardly next to the cheese platter. Phone calls to her parents grew longer and more frequent, her voice softer in the carved-out sanctuary of the upstairs guest room. She downplayed the awkwardness, insisting she was just adjusting. But the loneliness pressed in, a shadow at the edge of every interaction. Yet determined to fit in, Emily tried to bridge the cultures in small ways. She joined Mrs. Carter on shopping trips, smiling as the sales clerks greeted them as mother and daughter. At Sunday church services, she dressed in muted shades to match the rest of the women, though the rituals still felt foreign to her. She even watched hours of videos on etiquette, hoping the rules would reveal themselves with time. And still, every success felt precarious. At family gatherings, relatives joked about how Americans love diversity. But Emily sensed an undercurrent, that she would always be a talking point, not simply a family member. Every friendly greeting seemed to wait for her to fumble. Every question about her upbringing was followed by a too enthusiastic nod, as if ticking off a box on some invisible checklist. The hardest part was with Michael, her one true ally, but now increasingly caught in the crossfire. He assured her that his family would come to love her, that she just needed to give it time. But he didn't always notice the chilly pauses after her remarks, or the way his mother's compliments landed more like veiled instructions. As autumn settled in outside, Emily felt the weight of unspoken expectations thickening around her. The warmth of her new home was palpable, but it belonged to rituals and stories built long before she had ever arrived. And while everyone was outwardly polite, Emily sensed that her every move was under silent scrutiny, assessed not just as herself, but as the family's newest, most fragile secret. The process of belonging, she realized, was not a matter of being invited in, but of learning precisely which boundaries were never meant to be crossed. Bullying in isolation. Emily's initial sense of being out of step gave way, over the passing weeks, to something more bruising. A series of small, calculated jabs that cut deeper than she cared to admit. Bullying in the Carter household was rarely loud or public. Instead, it moved like a cold wind through narrow corridors, in offhand remarks, in too long silences, in looks exchanged across a room that said more than words ever could. It began with comments about her appearance, always couched in the language of well-meaning advice. "Maybe try a different shade of foundation, something less yellow," suggested Aunt Diane, holding a catalog up beside Emily's cheek with a scrutinizing gaze. "Have you ever thought of straightening your hair? It might suit you better." There was a constant, unspoken comparison. What she had worn, how she styled her hair, or what food she brought for lunch at family events. Any deviation from Carter expectations triggered a tense hush, followed inevitably by whispered discussions out of earshot, but always within her awareness. Some members of the family took it further. Michael's cousin Brian, an insurance adjuster with a biting sense of humor, made jokes that always seemed to revolve around her name, her exotic looks, or her spicy heritage. "Hey, Em, you bringing some of that stinky stuff for Thanksgiving this year?" he'd say, only half grinning, the table quiet, save for a few nervous laughs. When Emily tried to respond, she was often cut off. "Relax, it's just a joke." Other acts were subtler, but no less cruel. Her favorite mug would mysteriously disappear from the kitchen, showing up days later under a pile of dirty dishes. Her shoes would be knocked aside in the entryway, the only pair never neatly aligned in the row. Group texts about family brunches were sometimes sent to everyone but her, and she'd learn about them only after the fact when the others mentioned a wonderful Sunday morning together. Emily's efforts to assert herself, suggesting new recipes, volunteering ideas, asking to join outings, were too often met with sighs, glances passed over her head, or a change of subject. Even Hallie, Michael's younger sister, seemed uncomfortable around her now, torn between kindness and loyalty to the family's unspoken code. At times, Emily caught Hallie's eyes lingering on her with uncertainty, or, worse, pity. Only Michael remained steadfastly supportive, but even his optimism wore thin. Late at night, Emily confided in him about Brian's comments or Aunt Diane's critiques. Michael hugged her and urged patience, but his reassurances felt increasingly hollow. He wanted everyone to get along, to look past differences, convinced that time would smooth the family's rough edges. But Emily knew the wounds were not just from misunderstanding. They were crafted by prejudice and a fear of what was unfamiliar. Gradually, she withdrew into herself. She avoided lingering around the kitchen too long. She took longer walks alone, her phone clutched tight like a lifeline. At work, she found herself dreading the evenings, calculating how to avoid small talk with her in-laws. Even phone calls to her parents, once a source of comfort, became bittersweet, as she downplayed the extent of her loneliness and pain. The most isolating moments came during family gatherings. Surrounded by laughter and banter, Emily felt like a ghost, seen but never really acknowledged. The Carters prided themselves on being open-minded, but the boundaries were unbreakable as glass. She began to feel invisible, her own voice growing smaller with each passing day inside the stately house. In the privacy of her room, Emily sometimes stared at her own reflection, questioning if something about her truly was wrong or unacceptable. But deep down, she understood. It wasn't her hair, her accent, or her customs that isolated her. It was the refusal of others to meet her halfway, to accept what I couldn't see as familiar. The realization stung, and yet, somewhere beneath her sadness, a quiet resilience began to stir. A determination not just to endure, but to one day reclaim her dignity. Little did she realize that the same outsider status that made her vulnerable would soon become the source of her greatest clarity and, eventually, her courage. The first discovery. Work had always been a steady current running through Emily's life. Numbers, documentation, the neat columns, and tidy rows of spreadsheets. They made sense when so little else in the Carter household did. So, when Mrs. Carter approached her late one afternoon and asked, almost distractedly, if Emily might help organize a bit of the family paperwork, it felt like a small chance to prove herself useful. Helping would give her something practical to do, perhaps even inch her closer toward acceptance. That evening, Emily settled into the study, a high-ceilinged room lined with heavy bookshelves and the faint smell of printer ink. A battered filing cabinet in the corner held the Carters' archives, tax forms, bank statements, investment summaries, medical bills, donation records. It was a mountain of envelopes, manila folders, and half-finished to-do lists, chaotically labeled and carelessly stacked. Emily rolled up her sleeves and started sorting, grateful for the familiar logic of organization. Half an hour became 2, then 3, as she worked methodically through the loose piles, dividing them by year and color-coding them by type. The task was mundane but comforting. Her only companions were the ticking of the brass wall clock and the muted sounds of laughter drifting from the living room down the hall. She was almost finished with the 2019 folder when something odd caught her eye. Tucked between 2 property tax bills was a thick, stapled packet, an end-of-year summary from a charitable foundation she'd never heard of. Hope Horizons Fund, the masthead read, in cheery blue ink. But the address listed wasn't the Carters or any company she recognized. Puzzled, Emily glanced over the transaction records inside. Large sums of money funneled out, some returning within weeks in smaller increments. She frowned. Donations weren't supposed to be reversed. Setting the packet aside, she pulled a few more folders labeled Foundations from the next drawer. She found one, Sunny Pathways, with similar bounce-back transactions masked as project reimbursements. Another, called the Community Empowerment Collective, showed the same pattern, a $50,000 donation out at $50,000. At first, Emily told herself these had to be mistakes, banking errors, or some rich people tax thing she didn't understand. But curiosity crept in, fed by the strange feeling that she'd stumbled onto something intentionally murky. She made lists. She mapped dates and amounts. The sums sent out always nearly matched those quietly returned, minus a small fee. Never with the same label twice. Everything was dryly professional in tone. But as she dug deeper, she noticed recurring signatures that didn't match any family member. An out-of-state address, Delaware, famous for shell corporations, began popping up. A quiet unease settled over Emily. It would have been easy to ignore all this, to tell herself it was simply her lack of experience with big money. She slipped the foundation files into a fresh folder, all the while telling herself she'd ask Michael about them later. But something, perhaps all those months of tense glances and unspoken tests, made her hesitate. Remembering snippets of overheard conversations, the catch in Mrs. Carter's voice whenever taxes or audits came up, she decided to keep silent for the moment. As she continued digging, Emily found another folder, this one labeled Westfield holdings. The Carters had never owned property in Westfield, as far as she knew. Opening it, she found a series of wire transfers between the Carter family account and a Westfield Holdings LLC. The details were cryptic, but a sheet of handwritten notes slipped between the statements showed calculations in Mrs. Carter's handwriting, referencing dividend reconciliation, expense reclassification, and board approval. Her heart thudded. Was this routine or something more? She realized all at once that she'd been trusted or burdened with access to the Carter family's financial engine room. She was supposed to organize, not investigate. Still, she couldn't help reading between those lines, seeing the steady ripple of money back and forth, always dressed up as something virtuous or necessary. The unraveling of her hope for belonging stung. She'd spent months teaching herself how to fold towels and pronounce unfamiliar cheese names. She'd learned not to talk about her family at the dinner table and to laugh politely at Ethan's offhand comments. Now, faced with this sudden, concrete evidence of something improper, a battle flared inside her. Should she say something? Was it even her place? Her mind spun with the possible consequences. Denial? Outrage? Or perhaps the further cold shouldering she'd been fighting so hard to avoid. Mrs. Carter might accuse her of misunderstanding, or worse, of betrayal. Michael could interpret her suspicions as an attack on the only world he'd ever known. Emily felt the tension gathering in her chest, cold and tight, as night deepened outside. Pausing, she pressed the backs of her hands to her face. Growing up, her parents taught her the importance of honesty, but also of discretion, never making trouble unless trouble could not be avoided. Yet their lessons also included courage and the quiet strength of standing up for what was right, even when it hurt. Emily felt both voices competing in her memory as she gathered up the folders and tidied the desk, careful to leave everything looking untouched. Hours later, lying beside a sleeping Michael, Emily stared at the ceiling, replaying what she had found. Her mind raced with images of ledgers and wire transfers, but also with memories of Mrs. Carter's thin smiles, the private jokes the family shared at her expense. She wondered if any of them would believe her if she voiced her suspicions, or if she'd simply serve as a convenient scapegoat, the outsider who didn't understand the family business. What Emily did not know yet was just how far these suspicious patterns went, or who in the family was truly involved. For now, she convinced herself she was gathering information, not making accusations. The risk was immense. She could lose the fragile bridges she'd built, the small gestures of acceptance she'd clung to, maybe even Michael himself. Every possible path seemed to split beneath her feet, with neither loyalty nor justice offering her an easy answer. The house was quiet, deep into the night. Emily's mind wouldn't settle. She lay awake, cataloging details, rehearsing conversations she never intended to have, sensing that her discovery marked a permanent shift in her place within the Carter household. Trust, once fragile, now seemed to belong to another world entirely. Yet even as anxiety knotted her stomach, a tiny spark of resolve began to burn. The patterns in those folders were too neat, too deliberate, to be innocent. If she walked away, ignored it all, she would become complicit, not only in the Carter's secrets, but also in the act of erasing her own integrity. Though she had yet to decide her next step, Emily understood that the act of discovery had changed her. She was finally, irrevocably, part of the Carter family, but perhaps not for the reasons anyone had intended. The first domino had fallen, and there would be no way to quietly put it back. Secrets unveiled. For the next few days, Emily moved through the Carter residence with a heightened awareness, every ordinary moment now underscored by a sense of quiet urgency. Sunlight streaming through the kitchen window felt colder, and even the rhythmic footsteps in the hallway seemed more measured. Though outwardly she behaved as the dutiful daughter-in-law, helping with groceries, folding towels, making light conversation at dinner. Inwardly, her thoughts churned over spreadsheets and cryptic wire transfers. She could not help but replay the logic of those transactions in her mind. Each time she passed the study, she felt a magnetic pull toward the battered filing cabinet. Its drawers hiding a puzzle she now felt compelled to piece together. Had she misread things? Was there a simple charitable explanation she was missing? Or was this the surface of something large and rotting beneath the Carter family's polished image? With no one suspecting the questions warring within her, Emily began her own quiet investigation. She waited for moments when the house was empty, for Michael to leave for work, Mrs. Carter to run errands, the cleaning staff to focus on other rooms. She started by scanning document after document, her fingers trembling with each recurrent address or familiar signature. She took painstaking notes, careful to return everything exactly as she'd found it, conscious of every creak in the hallway and every shadow passing by the door. Patterns began to emerge. Hope Horizons Fund, Sunny Pathways, Westfield Holdings, different names, different years, but always the same rhythm. Large donations out, smaller sums returning as reimbursements, consulting fees, or project spendings. Sometimes the entities vanished after a year, replaced by other foundations with equally generic names and mailbox addresses in states known more for corporate secrecy than transparency. It became apparent that this was not a clumsy error or a single unreported donation. It was a system, slick, habitual, and hidden in plain sight. Emily found emails too, printed and saved, perhaps for tax records, or forgotten in the shuffle. Some were thank yous from nonprofits, lavishly worded to the generous Carter family. Others were terse, business-like confirmations from law firms about incorporation dates, privacy services, or requests for banking details to be sent only via encrypted files. The sense of foreboding grew stronger with every file she unlocked. The most chilling evidence, though, came in the form of personal notes. Emily stumbled across a slim, leather-bound planner tucked behind a row of cookbooks in the kitchen. At first glance, the pages looked like nothing unusual. Reminders for dinner parties, golf tournaments, donation deadlines. But interspersed throughout were cryptic lists, initials matched with amounts, arrows drawn between different charities, and shorthand notes about board disbursement and optional audit flag. The careful, businesslike script was unmistakably Mrs. Carter's. What shocked Emily even more was the potential scale of it all. The Carters were not only shifting their own assets, they were acting as funnel points for money from wealthy friends and local business associates, creating a network of opaque transactions. Her mind swiftly conjured worst-case scenarios: money laundering, tax evasion, embezzlement. The Carters' circle of dinner guests, bankers, attorneys, real estate developers, took on a dimmer tone in her memory. Waves of guilt and fear flooded Emily as she sifted through the growing stack of evidence. She could not shake the feeling of betrayal. Not just hers, but a betrayal carried out in tidy, clinical increments by the very people who had insisted, with smiles and gentle touches, that she was now one of them. It occurred to her that her presence, her status as outsider, was now both her greatest liability and her greatest protection. She knew she was expendable, but also that the family's secrets were safest with the one person presumed too naive to notice. Each day, the act of keeping this knowledge hidden drained her further. She rehearsed casual conversations with Michael and his parents, masking her real thoughts with polite laughter and nods. Alone at night, curled up in bed, she stared at the ceiling, trying to work through her options. Should she confront Michael directly and risk his loyalty to his family? Should she go to the authorities without warning and risk an explosion that might swallow her whole? Emily began to notice changes in the Carters' behavior, too. Mrs. Carter had always been reserved, but now she watched Emily with a sharper, more appraising gaze. Emily wondered if she had been too obvious, if her longer trips to the study or her discreet phone photos of ledgers and statements had somehow been noticed. One Saturday afternoon, Emily overheard a tense phone call between Mrs. Carter and someone from the foundation. Words drifted through the closed door. Timing. Delay the audit. Who else knows? Emily crept silently to her room, her heart thudding with the realization that the clock was ticking for everyone involved. Conflicted, she reached out, anonymously at first, to a legal advice hotline. The disembodied voice on the other end walked her through the differences between questionable accounting, outright fraud, and what might trigger a federal investigation. If you have documentation, the voice urged kindly, make sure you protect yourself first. The magnitude terrified her. This was not just about awkward family dinners or social rejection. It was about careers, reputations, and possibly criminal charges. The emotional toll weighed heavily, but Emily refused to allow the fog of fear to paralyze her. She created encrypted backups of the documents she'd found, storing them in the cloud and on a flash drive hidden at work. She kept a running log detailing how she discovered each anomaly, trying to be methodical in ways she never had to be in her own family. Michael noticed her growing anxiety, but misattributed it to homesickness or marital stress. He drew her into his arms many nights, promising her things would get easier, urging her to give his family more time. Emily wanted to believe him. She wanted this all to be a colossal misunderstanding, some eccentric old money trick for minimizing taxes that, while ethically gray, was not outright criminal. But each night, the evidence pulled her deeper out of denial. Her mind replayed the insidious ways the family had kept her at a distance, never close enough to ask real questions, always presented with the shiny surface, but not the machinery beneath. She began to grasp just how much was at stake, not only for the Carter family, but for herself, the immigrant's daughter who could not unsee what she now knew. In the final moments of each day, as she stared at her own reflection and wrestled with the choices ahead, Emily realized she could never go back to being the silent daughter-in-law. The secrets she uncovered, layer by layer, had transformed her from an outsider to a witness, and, perhaps, into the only person in a position to demand the truth. Standing at the threshold of truth days passed in a fog of tension. Though the Carter house retained its outward calm, silverware polished, schedules kept with precision, voices pitched at polite conversational tones, Emily could feel a difference thrumming behind every interaction. She sensed her own world closing in, shrinking to a fragile bubble of secrets and doubts that followed her from the study to the kitchen, and even, at night, into uneasy sleep beside Michael. By now, Emily's internal dilemma consumed nearly every waking moment. The evidence she had gathered was no longer something she could ignore or write off as benign. Each document she had scanned, every cryptic ledger entry she'd backed up, weighed on her conscience. And the more she read, the clearer it became. The Carter family's philanthropy was a mask, obscuring patterns of self-benefit, shell companies, in transactions returned under carefully disguised labels. She had unearthed more than one family secret. She'd uncovered something possibly criminal. Her upbringing taught her about loyalty, the importance of preserving harmony in the family above all else. Yet her parents had also spoken quietly but firmly about integrity, that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was costly. Emily's mind spun in endless loops. Was her responsibility first to her new family or to the truth? Should she try to protect Michael by burying what she knew or honor her own sense of justice, no matter how much it would shatter his world? One evening, after another strained family dinner, Emily found herself alone in the darkened dining room, staring blankly at the empty chairs and spotless tablecloth. The echoes of laughter and conversation faded as the family retreated upstairs. She felt, powerfully, the distance separating her from everyone else in the house. In years past, such feelings of otherness might have been soothed by Michael's gentle presence or a long call home to her parents. Now, comfort felt as distant as the home she'd left behind. A different language, a different set of values. That comfort seemed even further away as she noticed how the Carters' attitude toward her was shifting. Mrs. Carter's questions had grown more pointed, her watchfulness unmistakable. "You've been in the study quite a bit, haven't you?" she asked one morning over coffee, her eyes not quite meeting Emily's. Ethan, Michael's brother, started to exclude her from family emails about finances and travel plans. Tiny omissions that seemed harmless, but were a sharp contrast to the earlier efforts to include her, however superficially. Once, Michael's younger sister Hallie stopped Emily in the hallway, concern in her eyes. "Is everything all right? You seem distracted." Emily wanted to blurt out everything, to unburden herself to the one person who might listen, but she couldn't trust that Hallie wouldn't slip up. Or worse, react with the horror and betrayal the older generation might show. In the nights that followed, Michael became her anchor. Yet even he was not immune to the subtle pressure gathering in the house. He'd grown more reserved, often preoccupied and worried, though still eager to reassure Emily. "Mom's just stressed with the charity gala," he insisted. "You're overthinking it, Em. Give it time." He didn't press about what was making her anxious. Perhaps he didn't want to know. Or worse, perhaps he already suspected and was choosing ignorance. But Emily could feel the walls pressing in. She jumped at every phone ring and knock at the door. A single conversation between Mrs. Carter and an attorney, overheard in passing. "We need to make sure all documents are accounted for before tax season," made Emily's heart thunder. Was she being paranoid? Or were there really glances exchanged when she walked into a room, conversations abruptly ending in silence? Her fears grew when she discovered a family meeting had taken place without her. Michael slipped up, mentioning it offhand late at night. "Don't worry. It was just boring financial stuff." Emily lay awake listening to him breathe, wondering if that financial stuff included her. If she'd unwittingly become a liability, everyone else was now strategizing around. Feeling the burden of her knowledge grow heavier by the day, Emily began weighing the risks of every possible choice. If she stayed silent, she might protect Michael from a world that could come crashing down. She might maintain her marriage, her tenuous spot in the Carter home. But what if the authorities found out anyway? What if silence made her complicit, and the blame, inevitably, found its way to the outsider? The immigrant daughter-in-law who didn't belong. An anonymous tip she knew wouldn't protect her if it ever came out. And if she confronted the Carters, they might turn on her, not with open rage, but with ice-cold exclusion and subtle cruelty. The same weapons they had always wielded. Emily found herself replaying scenes from childhood. Her parents' hushed lessons on honesty and discretion. Her own internal vows never to betray her dignity, no matter the cost. Never had she realized how difficult, how lonely such a promise could feel. On a Saturday afternoon, while organizing receipts in the kitchen, she caught the end of a heated conversation between Mrs. Carter and Ethan. Their voices lowered to urgent whispers when they saw her, but not before Emily registered the fear and resentment on Ethan's face. "She doesn't know what she's doing," Mrs. Carter insisted. "We need to be careful. Anything could happen if—" Emily fled to her room, her hands trembling. It was no longer a question of if, but when her world would rupture. Every bond she'd tried to forge, every bridge she'd quietly built, suddenly seemed fragile, ready to be wiped away by one honest confession. Desperate for clarity, Emily began journaling, privately, obsessively. She listed the facts, her feelings, her worst-case scenarios. She practiced, late at night, what she would say if she had to defend herself. Not as a vengeful outsider, but as someone who simply couldn't look away. Each entry was a lifeline, an attempt to sort fear from duty, isolation from the beginnings of a steely resolve. One morning, racked by exhaustion, she called her mother. The call was brief and cagey, codes and pauses substituting for direct honesty. "Sometimes, standing up is the loneliest path," her mother said gently, the words stinging in their familiarity. "But you have to decide what you can live with, what you can look at in the mirror every day." Emily bit her lip, holding back the flood of emotion until she hung up. By that evening, the household's tension was undeniable. Mrs. Carter was icy but polite. Ethan barely acknowledged Emily at dinner. Michael, sensitive to the brewing storm but unwilling to face it, retreated into quiet, forced optimism. Hallie, loyal but uncertain, kept her distance. Emily sat at the table, surrounded by chattering voices, acutely aware she was at the center of a silent crisis that would soon burst into the open. As she lay in bed that night, Emily realized the moment she'd tried so desperately to defer was almost upon her. She was standing at the threshold of truth, unable to ignore what she knew, unwilling to become what the Carters expected. Silent, complicit, erased. For once, the weight of being an outsider felt like a gift. She understood both what could be lost and what might be saved by telling the truth, no matter the cost. She stared out at the moonlit garden, the Carter estate, serene under the surface. Her heart pounded with fear, uncertainty, but also with resolve slowly forming inside her. Whatever happened next, she knew she would have to walk forward, with trembling hands, but unflinching in her decision. The threshold was before her, and this time, she would step across on her own terms. The decision to become a whistleblower. Sleep eluded Emily night after night, her thoughts writhing in endless loops. Each day, she went about her routine in a dull haze, working, folding, smiling on command. But nothing felt real. Inside, the truth pressed against her ribs with growing urgency. She reviewed the evidence over and over, each time confirming what her conscience already knew. She stood guardian over secrets too big and too dangerous for any one person to carry alone. Emily oscillated daily between a hope for deliverance and a paralyzing dread of retribution. On one hand, she could maintain her silence, cling to her fragile place in the Carter orbit, and, perhaps, convince herself that she misunderstood, that it was just a labyrinth of privileged accounting. Quirks, harmless in the end. But with every new morning, the facts grew starker in her mind. The Carters were no longer simply her in-laws. They were people maneuvering within a deliberately built web of deceit. The compulsion to act became inescapable. She found herself haunted by the memory of her mother's warning. Sometimes, standing up is the loneliest path. It rang in her ears as she dressed, as she stared into her reflection, and as she navigated the Carter home's silent wariness. Each time Emily looked at herself, she recognized, sometimes with terror, sometimes with pride, the signs of quiet resolve growing within her. The tipping point came one gray afternoon. Emily was in the study, hands mechanically organizing documents, when a sudden sharp knock startled her. It was Mrs. Carter, staring in, her gaze flinty. "Do you need any help?" she asked, voice taut and unnatural. Emily's hands clenched beneath the desk. "No, I have it under control, thank you," she managed, feigning a composure she didn't possess. Mrs. Carter lingered a moment too long at the door, lips pressed thin, before retreating with a mistrustful glance. Emily's chest tightened. The subtle surveillance had intensified. She knew she was being watched. The Carters' inherent politeness now felt like glass, cold, breakable, and full of pointed edges. All warmth had drained from the home, replaced by an anxious, brittle silence. The choice she'd spent weeks avoiding now demanded action. That night, Emily carefully gathered all she had: printouts, digital copies, logs she had hidden in innocuous file names on her laptop. She hesitated at the threshold of her room, eyes on Michael, sleeping peacefully, and considered telling him everything. But doubt swept in. How could she ask him to choose between her and the family that had shaped every part of his life? What if he refused to believe her, or worse, blamed her for daring to threaten his family's security? Fighting tears, Emily dressed quietly before dawn and left the house, her documents stashed deep in her bag beneath a scarf and a paperback. She drove to a nondescript coffee shop in the city, heart jackhammering each time the door opened. In a secluded corner, she dialed the legal hotline she'd found days earlier, her voice trembling, but clear, as she stated her intent. "I believe I have evidence of financial fraud, and I need to know how to proceed safely." The lawyer on the other end, Ms. Morris, listened intently as Emily disclosed her findings. "You did well backing everything up," Ms. Morris affirmed, her tone serious but not unsympathetic. "Before acting, we'll need to assess the risk to your safety and anonymity." Emily nodded, relief washing over her for having done something, anything, beyond silent endurance. For days, guided by Miss Morris's advice, Emily worked quietly but methodically. Each night, she reviewed her backups. She documented her actions with timestamps, annotated key emails, and created an encrypted copy on a secure cloud service. She also left a password-protected folder, labeled with nothing incriminating, with her best friend from college, someone entirely removed from the Carter circle. The decision to reach out to the authorities carried with it an overwhelming cocktail of fear, guilt, and a strange, cautious hope. Emily worried constantly about being discovered, about the Carter family's power and influence in the community. She thought of Michael, how much he might lose, how thoroughly his world would be shaken. At times, she almost convinced herself to turn back. Each time, though, Her own voice reminded her she would never forgive herself for complicity. Finally, after a particularly harrowing family dinner, one that ended with a barbed remark from Ethan about outsiders who don't understand how things really work, Emily could no longer wait. That night, she sent a confidential email to the Office of the Inspector General, attaching a carefully redacted selection of the documents with an encrypted note. I am a family member with first-hand access to ongoing financial irregularities. Please advise next steps and ensure my protection. The following morning brought no immediate reply, and Emily's nerves stretched taut with anticipation. Every ring of her phone startled her. She couldn't concentrate, couldn't rest. The very walls of the house seemed to vibrate with electric expectation. Within 2 days, a reply appeared in her inbox. Brief, official, and understated. The authorities had received her information. They would arrange a secure, anonymous interview through Ms. Morris and warned Emily not to discuss her suspicions or evidence with anyone in the household. Now, as investigative machinery ground into movement far beyond her control, Emily's sense of isolation reached a zenith. She watched the Carters at breakfast, Mrs. Carter checking her emails with uncharacteristic tension, Ethan and Michael locked in tight-lipped conversation, and wondered if they, too, sensed something ominous approaching. Hallie kept shooting her glances laced with uncertainty and concern, as though she felt the atmosphere thickening, but couldn't pinpoint the storm's cause. Every interaction became surreally weighted. To the Carters, Emily's politeness must have seemed brittle and unnatural. To Emily, the Carters' every gesture reeked of latent accusation. She found herself analyzing the smallest details. Mrs. Carter's frosty small talk, Michael's barely concealed worry, Ethan's restlessness. Was this guilt? Suspicion? Or simply the air of a family closing ranks, sensing a fracture they couldn't name? Sleepless nights returned, Emily torn between terror of the looming confrontation and a deep, hard kernel of pride. She steadied herself in moments of doubt by rereading her old journal entries, her fears, her reasoning, her lines of evidence. Over and over she asked herself, why am I doing this? Each reread brought the same answer. Justice mattered. Integrity was not just a word. She could not erase herself to fit the Carters' world, nor could she betray the values that had carried her family across an ocean and through decades of struggle. On the eve of her first official interview with the authorities, Emily stood at her window, gazing out at the inky suburban darkness cloaking the Carter estate. She feared what would come, the investigations, the laughter of family friends drying up, Michael's heartbreak. But the fear, for the first time, did not paralyze her. It moved through her, awakening a resolve sharper and steadier than before. For better or for worse, Emily had made her choice. The threshold had been crossed. There could be no turning back. In the lonely early hours, hearing the faint hum of appliances and distant traffic, she felt the exquisite ache of both loss and liberation. Whatever happened next, she would face it standing, fully herself, and finally refusing to be silent. Protection and confrontation. The morning the police arrived, the air in the Carter house was so still that it practically vibrated. Emily had been awake since before dawn, pacing the length of her room, her stomach knotted with a nervous anticipation that was part dread, part relief. She kept replaying the instructions she had received. Remain calm, answer questions honestly, and above all, ensure her own safety. When the doorbell rang, its chime sounded oddly out of place amid the quiet opulence. Mrs. Carter answered it with her usual practiced composure. But even from the stairs, Emily heard the tremor in her voice as she greeted the uniformed officers and a somber woman in a trim suit. Detective Breyer, whom Emily instantly sensed was not to be underestimated. With brisk professionalism, Detective Breyer informed the family that there were questions regarding some of their charitable foundations and business entities, and that all household members were to remain on the premises until further notice. Shock registered first as silence, then erupted as a volley of questions and sharp exclamations. Michael was the first to approach Emily, confusion and concern etched deep in his features. "What is going on, Em? Do you have any idea what this is about?" His voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with the pressure of the unknown. Emily reached for his hand, but her explanation froze on her tongue. How could she possibly speak the truth with so many eyes, both sympathetic and accusatory, fixed on her? The officers moved methodically, securing the home's exits and cordoning off the study and other rooms of interest. Ethan, the eldest son, bristled with anger, demanding to see their warrant. Mrs. Carter, her gracious mask slipping, alternated between disbelief and icy contempt, her gaze finally fixing on Emily with a new, unmistakable sharpness. For the first time, the family's shield of civility had shattered, replaced by a raw, bewildered hostility that made Emily shudder. Detective Breyer requested initial interviews in the formal living room, one by one, beginning with Mrs. Carter. The rest of the family scattered throughout the house, the grand halls now echoing with anxious footsteps and angry whispers. Emily found herself momentarily alone in the sunroom, staring through the glass at the blurred green of the garden, her mind ricocheting through every memory since she'd come into the Carter orbit. The scent of lilies on the windowsill was almost suffocating. Finally, it was Emily's turn. She entered the interview room uncertainly, clutching a folder of her own notes and backup evidence as advised by her lawyer. Detective Breyer's tone was calm but unwavering. "We're here to look at a number of irregular financial transactions and possible improprieties involving tax-exempt foundations linked to this household. Emily, we know you initiated contact. Are you prepared to help us understand what happened?" Emily took a steadying breath. Words came slow at first, but grew firmer as she recounted what she had discovered, how patterns in foundation paperwork had triggered suspicion, how transactions flowed and returned through a cluster of shell entities, how signatures and notations pointed to practices far out of the ordinary. She shared her backups, careful to distinguish between what she knew for certain and what remained a troubling hypothesis. Detective Breyer listened intently, probing for clarity, but never once dismissing Emily's perspective. She asked about Emily's role and about the atmosphere in the household. Was she ever coerced to keep silent or made to feel unsafe? Emily described the subtle intimidation since the paperwork came to light. The long silences, the sudden watchfulness of Mrs. Carter, the isolating effect of being simultaneously relied upon and excluded. It was nearly noon before Emily was allowed to step away, her head buzzing with equal parts relief and terror. As she walked into the kitchen, she found Michael waiting for her. His face was pale and tight. "Did you know about any of this?" he asked again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Please don't tell me you're involved." There was no point in dodging the truth any longer. "Michael," she whispered, "I was the one who told them. I had to. What they're doing, what your family is doing, it's not right." She braced herself for anger or heartbreak. What she saw instead was a look of devastating confusion. She reached for his hand, but Michael pulled away, wordless, retreating up the stairs toward his own spinning world of doubt. The investigation continued at a relentless pace. Technicians copied data from the Carter computers. More officers arrived to collect documents, interviewing household staff, reviewing financial records. Ethan's protests grew louder and more indignant, while Mrs. Carter became a marble statue, cold, proud, and entirely impenetrable. Only Hallie, huddled in a corner with her knees drawn up, seemed openly frightened, gray eyes darting from Emily to her mother and back as if searching for a safe harbor. By dusk, Emily's sense of exhaustion was total. The presence of law enforcement was paradoxically both oppressive and comforting. She felt trapped, but for the first time, not entirely alone. Her lawyer, connected by phone, offered steady advice. Do not engage in confrontation. Speak only when spoken to. Remember, what's happening now isn't justice. It's only the beginning of an accounting. Evening fell, casting long shadows through the mansion's tall windows. Emily wondered how it could be possible for the house to appear so unchanged, so outwardly magnificent, while the foundations beneath it had shifted forever. She drifted up to the guest room, where she once took solace in late-night phone calls to her parents. The room felt different now, more like a refuge than a prison. Late that night, Michael knocked quietly at her door. He did not sit. His hand shook as he spoke. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. I don't even know if I should. But I do know you didn't do it for yourself. Tears threatened on his lashes, but he did not let them fall. I just wish I'd known things weren't as perfect as I thought. His words almost broke her, but also affirmed the cost and necessity of what she had done. I wish you had too, Emily said quietly. But some truths can't stay hidden. Not forever. When Michael left, closing the door with careful finality, Emily lay down on the guest bed and let herself sob. All the confusion, the grief, the knowledge that nothing would ever be simple or whole again. But she also sensed something beginning, a fragile new layer of strength growing within her. For the first time since entering the Carter world, she felt protected, not by its illusions, but by her own stubborn refusal to be erased. Downstairs, the investigation pressed forward. Tomorrow would bring more questions, perhaps subpoenas or national headlines. But for this night, in the battered sanctuary of her own making, Emily held fast to one hard-won truth. She had faced her greatest fear and survived. And, in the crucible of confrontation, she had found in herself the power to endure justice and renewal. The verdict came down on a brittle, wind-swept morning in early spring, nearly 6 months after the investigation began. For weeks, the Carter estate, a place once synonymous with order and tradition, had been transformed. Its marble halls echoed with footsteps that didn't belong to the family. Attorneys, accountants, and investigators now came and went, their clipped voices replacing the old sounds of laughter and piano music. For Emily, the days blurred together in a haze of waiting. The winter had been long, defined by loss and scrutiny, sleepless nights, and the stark realization that her life, and everything she thought she knew about loyalty and belonging, had irreversibly changed. More than once, she questioned whether stepping forward had been worth all this pain. The Carters, her husband's family, her family by marriage, were indicted on multiple counts: money laundering, fraudulent use of tax-exempt foundations, obstruction, and conspiracy. The scale of the schemes stunned the community and shattered decades of careful curation of the family's public image. Each court appearance chipped away at the Carters' legendary composure. Mrs. Carter arrived each morning, head unbowed, but her posture had become rigid, her skin nearly translucent in the courthouse lights. Ethan raged quietly, his confidence unraveling as evidence piled up. Hallie clung to Emily's side for the first time, mute with uncertainty, while Michael grew thinner and quieter, haunted by his parents' disgrace. Their world, built upon appearances, was imploding beneath the hard light of truth. Emily was called to testify, first as a witness, then as the whistleblower, whose courage had made the entire investigation possible. Dressed simply, she answered questions clearly and without embellishment. How she had noticed the patterns, why she'd reported the anomalies, what she had endured in the months that followed. For the first time, her voice filled a room that could not ignore her. Courtroom eyes, once narrowed in doubt or skepticism, now regarded her with something approaching respect, even gratitude. Outside the courthouse, the story had captured public attention. Some saw the case as another glamorous scandal among the wealthy, fuel for gossip columns and business journals, but others recognized it was a pivotal moment for the community, a reckoning, proof that privilege did not equal immunity. Among Vietnamese neighbors who had watched Emily quietly for years, her name now circulated not as a subject of curiosity, but as a whispered source of pride. The day the verdicts were read, Emily sat in the gallery, hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Carter was convicted on multiple felony counts. Ethan and 2 associates pleaded guilty, exchanging testimony for reduced sentences. The judge, in sober remarks, made it clear that their actions had not only broken laws, but violated the fundamental trust at the heart of charitable work and community leadership. The news spread quickly. Members of the old social circles vanished. Michael, emotionally exhausted, told Emily that he needed to leave California to find some meaning in all this mess. He thanked her for saving him from a life of illusion, but quietly asked for space. Hallie applied for college on the East Coast and wrote Emily a careful, heartfelt letter, apologizing for her family's pettiness and welcoming friendship if Emily ever wanted it. For once, Emily did not feel like a ghost at the center of someone else's story. Though her marriage was broken, her future uncertain, there was a strange kind of clarity in the wreckage. She moved out of the Carter estate, packing her belongings in deliberate silence, thanking the household staff, and leaving the rooms she'd spent so many months trying to belong to without regret. The house was empty now, echoing with memories of conflict, lost trust, in the echo of secrets finally laid bare. Emily took a small apartment above a bakery on a quiet street not far from where she'd first lived after college. In the mornings, she woke to the smell of bread instead of roses, and for weeks, she simply walked along tree-lined avenues, through public gardens, sometimes toward the downtown office buildings where her new job at a nonprofit awaited. She found herself drawn to work that demanded accountability, transparency, and integrity. Every report she compiled, every oversight procedure she helped design, felt like building a piece of a sturdier inner foundation. As spring deepened, Emily felt old burdens begin to slip away. In her apartment, she framed a photograph of her parents, her mother in Ao Dai, her father at the temple, and placed it beside her own citizenship papers. She called home more often now, sharing not just news, but her doubts and small victories. To her surprise, her parents' voices were full of pride and relief. "You did the right thing," her mother said simply, and you are not alone. The city's Vietnamese community, once wary of the girl who had married up, invited her to speak at a local women's group. Emily nervously accepted, and on a warm afternoon, told her story to a room of mothers, students, and young professionals. She found that her scars did not frighten them. Instead, her honesty elicited nods of understanding. Questions filled the room, not just about the Carters or the case, but about fear, courage, and what it meant to remain true to oneself when the world expected silence. Emily's story was not a straight line toward healing. There were still days when regret ached inside her, when shame and grief tangled in her chest. Sometimes she saw Michael's photograph on her phone and wondered whether forgiveness, her own or anyone else's, would ever come. But other days shone with fresh possibility. New friendships, a growing sense of belonging, earned not by assimilation, but by honesty and shared experience. Gradually, she rebuilt the contours of her own life. She made friends at the nonprofit and in the neighborhood, hosted simple dinners where laughter depended on no one's approval. She read widely, memoirs, ethics, detective fiction, and began, tentatively, to write down her own story, hoping that one day it might help someone else find the strength to speak. Justice, Emily realized, was never about seeing her tormentors punished. It was about the restoration of integrity, dignity, and community. Her act had ruptured more than she had imagined, but it had also cleared the way for a life that belonged finally and fully to her. In the ruins of the Carter dynasty, she discovered an unplanned rebirth. She could walk freely, answer only to her conscience, and trust that even in loneliness, she was worthy of respect and renewal. Stepping into the future. Spring faded into summer with a gentle, almost merciful slowness. For Emily, the world seemed to grow softer and quieter after the storm. The Carter estate no longer haunted her dreams. Its marble hallways and hushed conversations felt like an echo from another life. As old wounds began to heal, she focused on rebuilding, not just in the practical sense of finding a new home and routine, but in the deeper work of piecing together a stronger, truer self. Her apartment above the bakery was modest but sunlit, filled with tiny plants on every windowsill and stacks of books on the floor. Mornings started with the aroma of bread wafting up from below, and sometimes, if she awoke before dawn, she'd watch the bakers at work, rolling dough, tending ovens, laughing quietly among themselves. The slice of community was small but grounding. Shopkeepers remembered her coffee order, and neighbors waved from their balconies across the alley. Work at the nonprofit absorbed her mind and energy. She threw herself into tasks she believed in: grant proposals for immigrant scholarships, transparency initiatives for local charities, workshops for vulnerable women on how to protect their rights. Her colleagues respected her pragmatism and her diligence, but it was Emily's empathy, sharpened by pain and isolation, that set her apart. She was meticulous about the numbers, but always her hands found time for an encouraging note left on a coworker's desk, a phone call to check in on a struggling client, a warm greeting to the shy newcomer at the monthly meetings. Gradually, the outline of her old life, marked by anxiety to fit in, by fear of misstep, blurred behind a different confidence. There was freedom in no longer having to cater to the unspoken rules of the Carter household. Yet, Emily knew she did not want rejection or pain to become the only compass for her next steps. Instead, she found herself drawn to the idea of balance, holding on to her Vietnamese heritage and her newly forged independence, carrying both the pain and the pride of having spoken out. This new sense of self demanded reflection. In quiet evenings, she would sit at her tiny desk with a cup of tea and journal her thoughts. Sometimes she wrote to untangle memories, her mother's quiet strength, her father's quiet laughter, the taste of home-cooked pho, the endless obligations of assimilation that had defined her younger years. Other times, she wrote unsent letters to Michael or Hallie, rehearsing words of apology, explanation, or thanks. She wondered if these letters would ever be delivered, or if they were only for herself, the first steps in forgiving what could not be mended. One afternoon, an email arrived from Hallie, brief, hesitant, but hopeful. Hallie wrote that she had graduated her first year on the East Coast, had made friends who reminded her of Emily, and missed their old conversations about life outside family traditions. "If you ever want to visit, my door is open," she wrote. Emily stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, her words gentle and patient. "One day, I'd like that very much." The possibility of reconnection on different terms was enough. Forgiveness was not instant and did not come easily. Emily saw Michael's name flash on her phone screen a few times, once for her birthday, once at Christmas time. Their conversations were short but honest. There were no promises of restoring the past, only acknowledgments of pain in the quiet, mutual wish for one another's peace. The love between them, battered but not erased, found new form in respect and understanding. Community, too, shifted for Emily. At first, some members of the local Vietnamese circle approached her with caution, uncertain how to process the spectacle of her whistleblowing. But with time, their whispers turned to approval, sometimes even admiration. Elderly women pressed her hands at festivals. Young mothers asked her about resilience at neighborhood gatherings. She was invited to speak at workshops, not just about justice, but about identity, the cost of belonging, and the courage it takes not to betray one's core self. She struggled sometimes with what home meant now. Acceptance was hard-won, both the kind offered by others and the kind she offered herself. She visited her parents often, sometimes spending weekends in the familiar chaos of their kitchen, preparing dishes from their home village, and listening to family stories told in overlapping streams of Vietnamese and English. Her parents spoke of pride more than worry these days, proud of her courage and integrity, proud that she had found her own footing, even as the world tried to shake it. Writing became another anchor for Emily's new life. The scattered notes and journals eventually gathered form. She drafted essays about the immigrant experience, the challenge of hyphenated identity, in the subtle, persistent power structures within even the kindest families. An editor at a local paper was moved by her story and invited her to write a column, short reflections, not on the Carter scandal, but on resilience and the ordinary heroism of everyday women. She did not shy away from her scars. In place of shame, she found room for grace and even humor, recalling, sometimes with a smile, how she nearly failed at folding the Carter's towels or embarrassed herself over the dinnerware's alignment. These memories no longer hurt. Instead, they marked the long, hard journey toward accepting imperfection as a form of wisdom. Emily also found small joys in the new routines she created. She took up yoga at the community center, learning to breathe through difficult memories. She volunteered to tutor immigrant children in English on Saturdays, and in their laughter, she saw reflected her own childhood longing to belong, to be welcomed, to feel enough. She hosted simple meals for friends, rice bowls, spring rolls, strawberry shortcake. The apartment, once filled with the weight of survival, filled now with easy conversation and unforced laughter. As the year ripened into autumn, Emily paused to reflect on how far she had come, not in distance or accomplishment, but in spirit. The future was still uncertain, but no longer terrifying. She had proven that loyalty to self need not come at the expense of loyalty to others, that bridges could be rebuilt even when old ones had burned, and that the strongest homes are those founded on truth, not appearances. Stepping into the future meant, for Emily, not a single dramatic leap, but many small, mindful steps. Patching relationships, remaining open to reconciliation, forgiving herself for the years of pleasing and the brief act of breaking away, and continually seeking spaces, literal and figurative, where she could belong without erasing herself. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, she closed her journal with a sense of completion. For the first time in a long time, Emily did not feel caught between worlds, but rooted in her own. She wasn't sure what the next chapter held. A new love, a bolder voice, perhaps a move to a city where no one knew her story. But she knew now that whatever came, she would meet it standing tall, her voice steady, self-intact. With quiet, blooming certainty, Emily stepped into her future, never perfectly finished, but wholly her own.